In this video, I'm going to talk about everything you need to know when it comes to renting a car to drive for Uber. How much does it cost? What are the requirements? How do you sign up? And more. Jumping right into it, let's start off with the requirements. First off, you have to sign up for Uber in general. I've done a bunch of videos about the requirements. I'm not gonna lie, the requirements for Uber, pretty simple, right? Typically, you have to be 21 years or older. It does vary city to city and state to state. You need a valid driver's license. They're gonna run a background check and also a driver's background check. So let's say your criminal record's clean, but your driving record is not. That is something they will look into. But basically, signing up and qualifying to drive for Uber in general, pretty simple for the most part. Now, let's talk about the process of renting a car. First off, you can see here that right now, again, when it comes to this given area, it can be as low as $260 per week. It does depend upon the vehicle. It does vary a lot. Now, going down here, I don't know why it's using data from Denver, Colorado. I don't know. I was there a month ago, so I don't know why it's saying Denver. It's kind of bizarre. But anyway, I'd say on average, so let's not look at this, right? We're going to do 20 hours. If someone came to me and said, okay, how much does the average Uber driver make? It depends upon the area. There's so many different factors. In case you didn't know, your location is the number one factor that determines how much money you can make as a driver. I'd say about 20-ish dollars an hour, 20 to 25. But when you factor in things like expenses, gas, etc., you're probably looking at not only how much money can you make, but how much money do you have to spend. Let's say 20. I think that's a good even amount. It might be more than that. It might be less. It also depends on how you drive. I've done a bunch of videos about how to make more money driving for Uber. I have a link listed below to a huge video I did about 25 pro tips for new drivers. So even though it says 540, I'd say whatever this number is, times by 20. So really 400, right? So let's say I'm gonna round this up to $300. That means in order for you to break even for that week, you have to drive 15 hours. Anything past that is profit, but you really have to drive 15 hours in order to break even, which, keep in mind, if you don't drive and you rent a car through Uber, I know this is captain obvious, but I might as well say it, you can potentially lose money. Like say this one week you're just lazy and you don't drive. I mean, I know you probably know this, but I might as well just say it, just as it's kind of important. This I'd ignore completely. So if I, like say, drive for 40 hours, I'm probably looking at about $800. Not this. Now, granted, it does depend upon how you drive and a lot of other factors, which I will talk about a bit later in this video. Now let's look at the marketplace. So let's say you've come all this way. You signed up for Uber. You qualify for Uber. You got your insurance in place. Yes, there are some insurance coverages when it comes to the rentals, but look into the three. Definitely have auto insurance. Definitely have rideshare insurance. Look into the insurance when it comes to rent a car specifically. You might not need that third part, but you never know. So now we're here. Now you're like, all right, it's almost like similar to buying something on Amazon or buying something online. I'm, of course, in LA. Again, I don't know why it showed me Denver before, but we're in LA. So you can see some of them are cheaper than what we saw. Now, I'm going to, let's say, go to a few different one of these. As you can see, I have some of them that are cheaper. So let's look at Avis, for example. I'm going to go down here to kind of the nitty gritty. I do suggest looking first off at this. Some places require a deposit, other places don't. Do you have roadside assistance or not, right? All these different things. In addition, look at these requirements. It does vary, rental place to rental place. They will run your credit, as they call it, a soft credit check. These are all things to kind of look into. Another thing then, if I go down here, is to look at the different offers. If I, look at Hive, this is actually only $239 a week. It's kind of interesting, and I don't know why that the EV is actually cheaper than a regular vehicle. Only $239 a week and includes unlimited charging. Not bad right there, right? In addition, and this is a big one too, I might as well mention, is the compatibility. For example, some vehicles, like bigger ones, can qualify for different types of rides compared to other ones. In this case, I could do Uber Green, which pays a little bit more. Not a ton, but a little bit more than a regular UberX ride. If, let's say, I go all out and I rent a Tesla, which we'll look at in a second, that's going to obviously qualify for maybe bigger rides, right? And again, I can look at all these different nitty gritty. I do suggest looking into everything as much as you can. All these different things, because for example, if your credit score is, like, say, 450, you most likely will not qualify because you must have a credit score of 500 or greater. Now, let's look at a Tesla. There's a reason why I'm bringing this up specifically. You can see here, rent a Tesla near you for $325 a week. So it's more expensive. If you think about it, if you look at, like, say, the other EV I showed you, almost $100 more per week, but there may be a benefit, right? Going down here, let's look at this real quick. Qualifies for Uber Comfort, so you can make more money doing that. Stop paying for gas, of course, it's an EV, et cetera, et cetera. And then going down here, here's the first thing you have to qualify for. As you can imagine, with everything I've showed you, I've tried to scrape the surface and give you the most basic information, but each, let's say, store is a bit different, and each vehicle is a bit different. For example, if actually you do want to rent a Tesla, you have to qualify for this. 1, you have to complete at least 1,000 trips with Uber, and 2, maintain a driver rating of at least 4.9. Now, lastly, I want to show you other options you have for a reason I'm going to explain in a minute. Now, I have here, if I go to offers, car sales, right? You can see used Toyota Camry starting at $10K. I have all these different things kind of popping up here. Then I have drive for a fleet, right? I have, if like say I want to do these, boom, high paying, big rides for Uber Black, Uber Lux, whatever. I have these right here. Some of them, $2,000 per week, can be very expensive. And then I do have these kind of like promo things here, right? As you can see, but for the most part, these are the ones that I might consider looking into, as each one has some pros and some cons. So let's talk about that. Now, with all this being said, with all these logistics and the numbers and everything I just talked about, is it worth it? Now, first off, there's two main questions when it comes to this. One, is it worth it to drive in general? Some drivers say absolutely. Some drivers say absolutely not. I have a video listed below in the description basically talking about, should you drive for Uber and potentially for Lyft in general? Should you be a rideshare driver? The second question, though, which I'm going to kind of talk about a bit more now, is, well, if you do want to drive, is it worth it to rent a car? And I'm going to be honest. In some cases, yes. In some cases, downright no. Now, let's talk about the premium rides first and then go into the basic rides. I want to start there. If, let's say, you live in a hotspot area, LA is a good example, Miami, Vegas, etc. Doing these, like, expensive Uber rentals, I'm talking about, like, say, the high-end ones, like I showed you, that could cost you $1,000 plus a week, could potentially pay out that amount. But in my case, I'm going to say more likely than not, no. I think that the tricky thing about those rentals is you are rolling the dice a little bit. Like, you live in Vegas. I've talked to some drivers who do these Uber Lux, Uber Black, these very expensive rides, and they can make up to $40 an hour. The tricky thing, though, is 1, it's harder to get those rides, and 2, you are kind of banking that those rides are going to pay for that rental fee. I'd suggest, if anything, start off with a basic rental in your area and work your way up. Now, one kind of unique middle category, if I look at the luxury rides or the normal rides, is Teslas. There's been a good amount of research to show, and I've also talked to a lot of drivers as well, who said, look, yeah, I spend more money for that Tesla. I do. But it's well worth it because I make more money doing more expensive rides, like Uber Comfort, for example. But the biggest thing is tips. I reviewed an article, I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, where someone went from their Camry to a Tesla, and their earnings like doubled or tripled, meaning that they, even though spending more money for that Tesla, even though they were kind of paying a premium, so to speak, thought it was well worth it because they made significantly more money in the long run. I do think this does depend upon the area. Like, if you live in LA, I interviewed one driver who said, yeah, I'm not gonna lie, man, I pay $400 a week, $1,600 a month to rent the Tesla. Well worth it. He's like, I make so much more money than my other vehicle. It is well worth it for me, right? However, I feel like LA is big on the environment, right? It's a very LA thing to have a Tesla. Like, Teslas are everywhere here. If, like, you were driving somebody somewhere else and you're driving somebody else in a different area, maybe the response to that Tesla might be a bit different. So I do think that, ironically, when it comes to renting the vehicle, the location and maybe the culture, if anything, might have an impact on that. Just all these things to keep in mind. Of course, you can always rent one, test it out. Let's say you're like, hey, nope, the ROI or the return on that investment, not worth it at all, then you don't do it. Now, though, let's move to, I think, the big part of this, and that is just in general. Not talking about the luxury rides or the Teslas. For 90% of the people watching this video, you probably want to know, well, just in general, should I rent the car? First thing I'm going to say is, remember, you have to spend money to make money. I'd say on average, you're going to spend between $300 and $400 a week, maybe even less than that. But I'd like to be more on the higher end, because let's say you do find a car and you're like, hey, I'm only spending $240 a week. Hey, that's awesome, right? And remember, I'd say for most drivers, you're looking at about $20 an hour. That is the number you should be thinking of. So if you're spending $300 a week, like I said earlier, you have to drive 15 hours just to break even. What this means, and a big thing you should look into, is what is your schedule? If someone came to me and said, hey, Mark, I'm going to drive part-time. I have a 9-to-5 job. I want to drive on the weekends. I don't have a car, though. And I'm going to drive part-time. Do you think it's worth it to rent a car? I'd say probably not. Being honest, I'd say maybe look into a different job. Now, maybe you can bust out, let's say 20 hours. You're going to do 20 hours on the weekends. Those 15 hours go away because you're really just breaking even on that rental. That extra 5 might make you what? Let's say $100. To some people, that may be worth it. But then you have to look at the full picture. And this is very, very important. If I drive 20 hours, right, and let's say I make $400, well, $300 of that goes to the rental, $100 goes to my pocket. I made $100. But then you realize, well, if I do $100 divided by 20 hours, because remember, even though I made $400, I really only made $100. I technically just made $5 an hour. Is that worth it? I think for most people, they'd say no. And that's what you have to kind of do. It's not the math of, okay, how much can I make after I break even? Although that's important. We'll talk about that in a second. But you have to consider that all the time that you drive does get included. I didn't make $400 in 20 hours. I technically really only made $100 in 20 hours, which means my hourly rate really, when it comes to the money in my pocket, is $5 an hour. That's probably not worth it. Which is why I'm going to say, if you are renting a car, to drive for Uber, just go full time. Now, this can be a tricky thing. So I do suggest, and I say this to a lot of drivers, and I always say this, test out the waters. You may drive for Uber and you might love it. And there's a lot of drivers who do. And they rent a car and they love it. There's a lot of drivers who don't. And they started and they're like, this is not for me. You don't know until you try. But this is something to keep in mind that I think just, you have to look at that math, that anything past the break-even point is profit. And remember, one thing that I will say, I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons, right? I'm kind of going back and forth a little bit. As a pro is, one, and I think this is a huge one, the barrier to entry when it comes to Uber is pretty low compared to other jobs. I said this before. I've seen some accounting jobs. I went to a 4-year university, got my accounting degree, a lot of studying, and they say, hey, we need somebody with a bachelor's degree in accounting, starting you at $22 an hour as an internal auditor. I'm just making numbers up, or a bookkeeper, or whatever. Or I could just drive for Uber and make pretty much the same amount, right? So low barrier to entry, flexible schedule, as we all know. You have instant cash outs. The big one for this video I want to highlight is, for the most part, you could drive an unlimited amount of hours. It's not like when I was a bartender that someone would go to my manager and say, hey, I got to work more. Can you give me more hours next week? And my boss would be like, no, we're booked up. I can't give you any more hours. Not the case with Uber. There are some legal limitations just for safety reasons when it comes to driving. Typically, though, in your area, it's 12 hours a day. Typically. Does depend, but typically. So you're really looking at about 84 hours a week that you can drive. Meaning, if it, let's say, it takes you 15 hours to break even on that rental, every hour after that is 100% profit in your pocket. That is pretty awesome. In addition, you're not putting maintenance, wear and tear on your vehicle. There's a lot of benefits, I will say, to renting. And I have talked about renting a car versus having your own car, which I'll touch upon in a second, because I do think it's an interesting thing I'll bring up. But in general, I think the benefit of renting is, if, let's say, you're like, Mark, I got to make money. I'm trying to make money. I'm looking into Uber. It's a flexible schedule. I can work around my schedule, and I can drive a theoretical, unlimited amount of hours and make money. I say, you know what? Knock yourself out. I talked to one driver who, which I don't know how she did this. This blows my mind, but it was kind of interesting to hear. She told me that she said she spent 1 month one time. I was interviewing her talking about driving. And she said, I went pretty much all out. She goes, I drove 12 hours a day, every day for 1 month straight, nonstop. she made, I think it was between, I'm trying to remember her exact amount, but it was between like $10,000 and $11,000 for that month. Now, granted, she drove an absurd amount, but it is kind of interesting that let's say you're like, dude, I'm $6,000 in debt. I got to get out of this debt. It may suck and it may be miserable. I can't even imagine doing that. I feel like I'd go mentally insane, but you could just drive for 1 month, say this 1 month is going to be pretty bad. You get it done. You make 10 grand, put that in your pocket, pay off 6 grand of debt. You got 4 grand after that because you paid off that debt. I mean, that's the benefit, I think, to Uber and rideshare in general is that you can just go all out. If you want to go crazy, you can go crazy. And like, if you don't have a vehicle, the rentals are there for you. It's kind of that paradox, like I think everyone's experienced, where you say, okay, I need a car to get to that job, but then I need a job to pay for the vehicle. Not the case with a rental. And one last thing I do want to mention, though, and I think this is an important point to bring up with all these positive and negatives, is buying a vehicle. This is something that could be, a very in-depth video in and of itself. But if you look at, like I showed you briefly, I touched upon it, there's different options that you can click through Uber to buy a vehicle. And it is pretty intriguing because if, let's say you're looking at, it depends upon your credit, depends upon a lot of different factors. But if you're looking at spending, I'm making this up, let's say like $350 a week to rent a car. I think, depending on your credit and a lot of different factors, there may be vehicles out there that you could probably spend $350 a month. And you can then use that car whenever you want, however you want, and you don't have to be spending a ton of money and shelling out that money. You're going to be spending significantly less just to use that vehicle, and it's your vehicle. You own the vehicle. I do suggest not leasing because the miles can rack up, and that's a bit of an issue in and of itself. But that is something I will look into. The biggest issue, though, I think, as you can imagine, is depreciation. There are some benefits, of course, to renting a vehicle. If lets you have your own vehicle. I had one friend, this is years ago. This is back in the day when things were a bit different. But back in the day, one of my good girlfriends rented a car through Uber because she's like, hey, I drive pretty much full time. I don't want those miles going on my car. It was only $200 a week to rent a car. And she goes, hey, I pay $800 a month. I'm not going to lie, especially in Boston back in the day, you can make a good amount of money driving, not like it is now. She's like, I can easily, bang those $200 out in terms of rides pretty quickly, sometimes in a day. And then she goes, everything past that's profit, no depreciation on my car, no maintenance or extra work. I'm not having to screw up my brakes. I'm not having to, all the kind of stuff when it comes to owning a vehicle. She goes, I'm pretty much golden, right? And she loved that. So there are some advantages. So this is something I will look into. Let's say you're watching this video, and at the end of this, you're like, okay, well, I have been considering getting a car, maybe just a random, used vehicle. Maybe I should do that as opposed to renting a vehicle. Again, pros and cons to both. But I think one good thing at the end of the day is you can always kind of jump back and forth. You can always say, you know what? I'm going to rent a car, see how it goes. If it works out well, you may keep doing it. If I don't like it, I don't drive for Uber ever again. Or, and I think this is the biggest one, if let's say you're like, hey, I have no money. I'm like complete, like bottom line, starting at the lowest starting point possible, and I got to work my way up. You rent a car, you bust your butt, you save money, you then maybe buy your own vehicle, you then continue driving with that vehicle because now obviously you're saving costs as opposed to spending all that money on the rental. And yes, maybe you're putting depreciation and more wear and tear on your own vehicle, and of course the value is going to go down inevitably, but at least you have a starting point. I think that is the benefit to renting a car through Uber. There are definitely a good amount of pros and also a good amount of cons. But at the end of the day, the Uber rental program, for better or for worse, and again, you could argue on both sides if it's really, really good or really, really bad, it does allow you at any point to start driving and make money.